Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this public lecture on the use of evidence in international development. My name's Phil Davis. I'm Deputy Director for Systematic Reviews at 3IE and responsible for the London office of 3IE. If you don't know us, we have three offices. 3IE headquarters is in Delhi. And Delhi takes responsibility for much of our impact evaluation program. We have the office here in London, which focuses on systematic reviews, and we have another smaller office in Washington, all of whom are some way, I think, represented here today. So welcome to people from other offices of 3IE, but welcome to all of you for what we hope is an interesting and stimulating lecture on the role of evidence in international development, which for us is what we're all about. You probably know, some of you anyway, that our vision is to improve lives through impact evaluation. And we do that by trying to make sure that research and evaluation in international development is of the highest quality, is most robust. And we're going to discuss what that involves this evening. We fund research at 3IE, and we support it, we give technical support, we quality assure it, and we help build capacity both for people to demand good evidence on the demand side of policymakers and practitioners, but also on the supply side as well. That's what 3IE is about. So that's really why we're here this evening. Evidence, of course, is always contentious. It's seldom self-evident. It derives its meaning from the interpretations we give to it, from what we bring to it from our theoretical perspectives, and let's be honest, often from our beliefs, our values, and our convictions. So to deny that beliefs and values have a role to play in evidence would be myopic. I think our task is to try and join those beliefs, or challenge those beliefs, those convictions, those values with the best available evidence based on sound empirical research. And I think when we bring those two domains together, we begin to get a more powerful tool for making better informed decision-making about international development, or indeed any other area of public policy. So we also hold very dearly at 3IE the idea that empirical evidence must be grounded in good theory, which is to say, how are programs, how are policies supposed to work? What is the logic underlying them? And can we start joining up the intervening bits between the inputs into policy evaluations and the outcomes we seek to achieve? And I think especially Howard this afternoon will be speaking of that. Because we try and do both. When we fund research, we're looking for people who are competent at doing evaluation and research, but also who can ground that in a good knowledge of how they think the programs to work, so that we can test that empirically and we can build a causal chain between the inputs and the outcomes. We try not to squabble in the paradigm wars that go on. We don't always escape it. We're not terribly interested in them, except to really challenge myths and what we see as myths and misconceptions about what counts as evidence, the role of randomized controlled trials, and indeed other quasi-experimental evaluations where randomized designs are not possible. And that's what I think we're going to try and do tonight. We're trying to think about some of the challenges there have been to doing impact evaluation in international development and to respond to them. To do that, we have two distinguished speakers and two very close friends. Well, one of them is our director, so we have to say he's a friend. But first of all, many of you will know Professor Chris Whitty, late of this parish, in fact still of this parish, I believe, but for the last few years has been Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for International Development here in London. So Chris is both now a policy advisor, a scientific advisor in the policy domain, but also a distinguished clinician and academic here at the school. A lot of you will also know Howard White. Howard is the executive director of 3IE and has run it from its creation in 2008. Before that, Howard was head of the impact evaluation group at the World Bank and has undertaken a number of major impact evaluations. So there are two speakers. We're going to give them roughly 25 minutes each and then open it up for discussion and questions, which I shall try and administer as well as I can. Show your hand, and we'll probably take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and we hope to get a stimulating discussion underway. So let me start by asking Chris to please join us and talk to us on testing what we think we know in international development. Would you please welcome Chris Whitty?
Thanks very much. Are these microphones working, just so I know whether I have to shout? Good. I was set a topic which some of you may have seen on the flyer, and I was even actually given some sort of notes on how to answer the question properly, which I didn't actually write myself, so I'm going to stick broadly to the theme I was given, but I'm going to do a sort of variations around that. And my text for the day is one from Oliver Cromwell when he was writing to the Presbyterians. I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you may be mistaken. And the reason that I was asked to talk by Howard and his colleagues about what evidence-based medicine can potentially teach, positively and negatively, those of us who are looking more widely in international development, obviously in health, but in other areas. Now, most of my job, I spend my time trying to pretend I'm not a doctor, so people don't have preconceptions as to what I'm going to say and think. But on this occasion, I'm going to take a specifically medical line. And I think medicine does have something to offer other areas, starting with the fact that it has been, and probably still is in many areas, frequently, profoundly, and absolutely wrong. And it is wrong by people who are extremely well-intentioned, highly educated, very reflexive, highly paid, and are doing their best, and yet they have got things historically wrong multiple times. And most of the time, they have no idea that they've got things wrong. And so if you look in the history of medicine, we have large numbers of examples. Bleeding, regularly done for people who are actually just about to go into labour, not an entirely helpful thing to do. Leeches, of course, an old favourite, and the gradual move from this sort of medicine to this sort of medicine has been quite a slow process with many battles. We've poisoned people with mercury and arsenic and a whole variety of other things, all with the best of intentions, and all of them with the best minds, all agreeing this is the right thing to do. So I think that's the starting point for medicine. And the most fundamental point about that is if you don't test, you don't know. If you don't test, then everyone can sit around and all agree that it's a jolly good idea you do X, and all the experts agree on that, and you can go home in the evening feeling you've had a day well spent. Now, of course, we're all prisoners of our intellectual past, and around almost exactly the time that I first became a clinical student, a clinical trial came out which profoundly influenced the thinking, really, of my generation. It was the ISIS-2 study. It was 17,000 people with a myocardial infarction and a heart attack, and it was measuring 2 different interventions. And you'll see the relevance of this later in international development. One of them aspirin, one of them a new drug called streptokinase, and what it demonstrated was that aspirin, a drug which had been around for 70 years or more prior to this, led to a reduction in mortality from people who had a heart attack of 20% on its own. And if you added in new treatments, you dropped it to 40%, by 40%. So there you had a situation where the mortality in one trial for heart attack, at that point, the commonest cause of mortality in the UK, dropped from 13% to 8% with a single study, and has stayed. And from then on, incremental changes mean that in some recent series, the mortality rate if you go into hospital with a heart attack now is around 2%. Each one of these changes tested one after another. That was profoundly influential on all of us. We learned 3 things from it. First of which, you can make massive changes in your thinking by doing studies well. The second was, many of the best solutions are old and cheap, and you didn't even know about them until you tested them. Aspirin had been around for ages, and yet it had not been used by doctors for this purpose, except in relatively specialist areas. And the third thing we learnt was that the very senior doctors who had spent 35 years of their life saying to people the best thing with heart attacks is to stay in bed for 4 weeks and do nothing, were completely wrong, but wrong with a very good mentality behind it. So it empowered us as junior people to think, actually, we can, by reading the journals, know as much about how to treat things, if the study's been well done, as our professors aged 55 with a very long, distinguished career behind them. And that was very empowering and a very important thing to learn. And the other thing which came along, trials weren't new, but the size of these trials and the definitiveness of these trials were really new at this stage, were systematic reviews. And systematic reviews were introduced because we recognised that the old way of doing reviews, which is to get a senior doctor or professor in any other area, I would be a pretty good candidate for these days, to write their prejudices down and put a few references to their own work and that of their friends. That, I'm not caricaturing very much by saying that was what a lot of reviews were. And we realised that the quality of the evidence that was cited in reviews was highly variable. There was a heavy positive publication bias. If you had a study which actually found that there was a 30% reduction in mortality, it went into the Lancet. If it found a 5% mortality, it went into Transactions of your own discipline. And if it found almost no effect, just as good a study, then it would get, if you were very lucky, into the Transylvanian Journal of Psychodermatology. And so you had a situation where it was very difficult to get the key negative findings that balanced the positive enthusiasm. Few studies were definitive, and when all studies point the same way, that's very important and tells you something about generalizability. Equally, if you find something works in Malawi, doesn't work in Ghana, doesn't work in Cambodia, that tells you probably something about the mechanism if the studies are well done. So systematic reviews were a way of trying to get round that by having a much more methodologically rigorous approach to finding all the evidence and then bringing it together. And sometimes with added in meta-analysis, but really that's necessary. Now, these principles do not have only to apply to quantitative studies. In fact, there's no reason why these principles are relevant only to quantitative studies. They are general principles. So the combination of definitive trials, although trials have been around for a while, and systematic reviews, a relatively new tool, really launched, and I'm simplifying a complex area of history in medicine, launched the evidence-based medicine movement. And the evidence-based medicine movement was the idea that people could come in with a whole series of individual studies which could tell you incrementally how to improve on our medical practice. And of course there were various ways in which the medical profession responded to this movement, and these findings, these ways of responding are in fact the ways that people respond to virtually all movements. There were the people, generally speaking peri-retirement, who took this approach. It's not happening, and I'm retiring in 3 years, so let's just forget about it. I'm still going to tell them to have bed rest and hope for the best. The statistics business was always a problem for me at school, and I haven't got any better since. There were, of course, always slightly tediously, the cynics. I'm using not the classical, for those who are pennants, and not the classical, but the 19th century view of the cynic. The cynics who always will say that whatever new advance there is, it's going to be dreadful, it's all dismal. And their position is dreadful, and then they find reasons why it's not a good idea. And there were always some of them. There were, of course, the true believers. Showing my age here by demonstrating that from the Blues Brothers. Those people believed that this was now going to revolutionize medicine, nothing would ever be the same again. These people are equally dangerous, I have to say. And actually the sensible people were the skeptics, people who looked at this and said, yeah, actually there are some important points here, but also there are some reasons to be careful. And a few of the concerns expressed, and the reason that I'm leading up to this, were ones which I hear expressed regularly about using impact evaluations or other forms of study of that sort in international development more widely. It's unethical to randomize. These are children's lives at stake. It's a very fair point, actually. It's easy to caricature. Every patient is different and every family is unique. I hear that again regularly when people are talking about the fact you can't generalize from a single study to the complexity of individual political situations. Good medicine comes after years of experience and not a mass of data. Half true. It does get better after years of experience. How would we be pleased to hear? But it also, mass of data improves it very substantially. Statistics improve anything, may be true, and policymakers are not influenced, particularly for public health areas, not influenced by data. They prefer anecdotes and ideology. This point, incidentally, is almost always made by people who've never worked in government. How they come to this conclusion, I've never really fully understood. Now, this unfortunately led for a short while, which has resolved within about 5 years, to a false dichotomy about what medicine was. On the one hand, there was the idea of medicine as science. It's medicine where if you just do enough experiments, you'll get to the right place in the end. And people who were taking a counter view to that caricatured this as a mechanistic approach, a mathematical approach to what was essentially an art which actually revolved a lot of reflexive thinking. And at the other end of the spectrum was the idea epitomized by this famous painting by Fildes of the doctor. Incidentally, the doctor he based this on treated his child. He painted the painting because he was so impressed by the doctor, but the child died. This doctor empathizing with the patient, taking the human touch. Now, of course, these two are not in opposition. The idea that actually you should care about the context, you should care about the situation in front of you, should never be seen as in opposition to getting the data right. But that false dichotomy was created in the minds of a lot of people at that stage. And again, I hear that debate echoed in many of the things which happen now. Now, taking some of the points which people raise, which are very fair, the ethical issues of doing experimental designs in particularly in vulnerable situations, and particularly where the outcomes can be very serious, are non-trivial. And medicine has struggled with this ever since experimental medicine really took off. And all I can say is that in medicine we have not solved these problems, but a set of rules have been created which help to confine the ethical problems to a manageable amount which society accepts and works within the ethical and legal frameworks of individual societies. They include always using the best locally available situation as a comparator. So you don't just compare your new whizzy idea with nothing if there's something else is available. The idea of equipoise. You should not be doing experiments if you personally have a very strong belief that one thing or the other is better, particularly if you think the old thing is better. It's got to be locally relevant. You should not be experimenting in Africa, and I've illustrated this as a constant gardener, on things which actually are intending to market in Europe. It has to be individual consent, and there has to be ethical review, which in a sense is societal consent, and a variety of other things. These kind of concepts, however, can put boundaries around the ethical problems associated with experimental design. It doesn't mean that big debates don't go on, and I'm going to illustrate this with the DART study and the recently published Arrow study, which came in the Lancet a few weeks ago. Funded by DFID, as it happens, that's not the reason I'm identifying it. It's an interesting study. It's a trial which was asking the question, do we need laboratory tests in HIV? And it was done in Africa. And the reason I'm highlighting it is that it was strongly opposed by some of the HIV lobby groups, some of whom actually stood up in HIV conference and barricaded the speaker, who was an African scientist, and shouted him down because he said it was unethical to have a lower standard of care, that was their view, compared to what there was in the States or Europe. And yet what this trial showed, and this is a good ethical review, it was locally relevant, it showed that actually you can treat a third more people for the same money because you can do fewer studies. This is a really important study for value for money and to improve the amount of HIV, and yet people opposed it on ethical grounds. So this is just an example that these situations, even in healthcare, which is relatively experienced at dealing with these, can go wrong on this. Despite the fact that there have been many challenges to evidence area, in fact, the evidence that is now available to us in healthcare and development is substantially greater, and this is my second biggest point, really, substantially greater than almost any other area of international development there is at the moment. And although it is not entirely cause and effect, there are definitely socioeconomic and other effects to this. The impact of this on Africa and Asia in particular has been dramatic. Quoting an Economist headline, Africa is experiencing some of the biggest falls in child mortality ever seen anywhere. That is absolutely true in almost every country, and I've illustrated this with some, in multiple different areas. And what this is made up of, and I'm illustrating this in Niger, not a country where you can say the falls in mortality are just due to socioeconomic development, because Niger is in a problematic state. This is a study in the Lancet, came out late last year, which showed that what you had was this significant reduction in mortality in Niger was made up of a whole series of individual steps, each one of which was based on evidence, and each one of which contributed a small amount to this, this overall transformational change. And one of the things I, again, hear people say is, we're not in the business of being incremental, we're in the business of being transformational. Well, the reality is, almost all transformations are made up of multiple small steps which add on top of one another. And each one of them, you've got to be able to demonstrate you're improving, and then you can build, like a wall, one on the next. I think another concern that people have had with impact evaluations and other kinds of studies is they say, well, it's all very well, all this methodology is around the individual. This is what these kind of studies are for. And many kind of individually randomized trials, for example, that criticism is entirely right. That is a correct statement. However, there are now multiple methods which have been designed to deal with the fact that many of the biggest problems in healthcare, and you can extrapolate this to all areas of international development, are in fact societal. They may be societal because they have multiple social influences. So what people think around you is going to heavily influence what you do in terms of your childcare arrangements, of your smoking, a whole variety of other areas. Or they may be, for example, because if I've got malaria and all the people around you have got malaria, you're more likely to get it yourself, so you will impact on other people. The fact is, you have to view people as a social group for a large number of healthcare problems, as for almost all other areas of international development. And therefore, many methodologies have been designed to help do this, of which cluster randomized studies, where the methodology, much of it was, certainly the analytical methodology was devised here at the London School, are one of the most powerful ones. There are ways of getting around the fact you want to introduce something everywhere and you want to see the effect. You can do what's called a step-wedge design, where you can actually roll things out in a systematic way. The idea of multi-center studies, where you actually do studies in many places to see how generalizable something is, does it actually find the same result everywhere, or does it find different results in different places? This is something which I think other areas of international development currently are really not using enough. And the idea of using a rational, randomized sampling frame that represents the society as a whole, rather than just finding the first 15 people who come off the street, seems to anyone who's trained in an epidemiological background a fairly obvious starting point, but it's not obvious in all areas of science. Trials, of course, are only one tool, and a very imperfect one. When you hear some people, for example, from some of our colleagues from JPAL talking about trials, I'm very much reminded of some of these tonics you can get in African markets, which cure your hemorrhoids and your impotence and your ingrowing toenail and your dropsy and your pneumonia and pretty well everything else. Trials are good at some things. There are many things for which a trial is either impossible to do rationally. For example, if you're doing something at a country level, you may not be able to properly do a trial. Let's say direct budget support in international development. They may be not appropriate to do because they're either ethically problematic, they're operationally problematic, or they're too expensive to answer the kind of question you're talking about. Trials, sometimes the right thing, and sometimes they're not. Wherever they happen, they are not the whole answer. And I'm illustrating this with a randomized trial where I was involved in a trial where there was a study done where we randomized doctors to getting tests for malaria or not, unsurprisingly to me, but not apparently the doctors, giving them tests gave them great pleasure but didn't change their practice at all. That wasn't the interesting thing. The trial just demonstrated the doctors are irrational, which we know. Which was much more useful was the fact that actually then some social science anthropology was done alongside that by Claire Chandler, I don't think it's here, but an anthropologist here at the school, and that was exploring why doctors behaved irrationally and what the things you could do about it. So tackling the qualitative social science, putting on the economics, these elements are extremely important in all areas of research. And medics, I have to say, can sometimes rush into the trial and execute perfectly, particularly when it comes to behaviour interventions, execute perfectly a trial where they have not done proper qualitative formative research first, so they answer the wrong question extremely well. So getting the question right in the first place is absolutely fundamental. I think an area where certainly I've recently come under quite a lot of blog attack, actually, to my slight surprise, is where people say, if you believe in evidence of this sort, then you don't believe in political structures. I'm summarizing very unfairly a rather more sophisticated argument. But I think it's really important to understand from the history of medicine that medicine not only is all areas of healthcare highly political and always has been highly political, it's political with a big P, as any understanding of UK politics, for example, demonstrates, it's political with a small p. Medicine is political even within a family unit. It's political at almost every level. It's also essential, if you're going to get your evidence into action, that you link your evidence and data with a proper understanding of the political process. And I'm just illustrating this two people, Florence Nightingale and John Snow. John Snow I'm only mentioning actually because it's his bicentenary and it's being celebrated at the school last year, but he was a very good example of someone who used data extremely well and analytically and then managed to engage with the political process to get change. Which we got the pump handle outside the theatre here. That was a bit of political theatre as a way of trying to actually get his evidence into action. But I think the more interesting example is Florence Nightingale, one of my great heroes, not for her work on nursing, remarkable though that was, but I think it's often underestimated how good an epidemiologist and statistician was. The first female fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, she developed a whole area of statistics, and she used data with an enormous impact. And the example I'm going to give is from India. She never set foot in India, never in her life, went anywhere near it. She did almost all of this from her bed in her room here in London and elsewhere in the UK. But she'd had an enormous impact on sanitation, irrigation and agriculture in India based on looking at ordinary data and extrapolating and bringing it together extremely effectively. She then backing up this rigorous statistics, where she had statistics which were far better than the India office and the UK government of the day. She then backed that up with low political cunning and shameless use of her multiple connections in politics and a lot of social idealism. And this combination of really good data linked with proper political understanding is how she drove social change. So I really don't want anyone to go away with the idea you just do the study and that solves the problem. That clearly is not the case. Of course, it's not all just about individual studies. A very important part of international development is, or should be, systematic synthesis. It's very tempting if you're in policy. I think anyone who's not worked in the policy environment would be staggered at the speed at which political decisions and policy decisions are taken. Compared to the academic, if you're an academic, fast means by the end of the term. If you're in policy, very often fast means by the end of the week. And your ability to actually bring together evidence in a serious way in that kind of time frame is clearly zero. So your options are you phone a friend, who usually will have their own biases, you ignore the data completely, often quite convenient, you know what you're going to do and you find a bit of data that supports what you want to do, or you've actually synthesized the data in advance. That is, and clearly only the fourth of those is rational. And for very few studies stand alone. You've got to bring stuff that brings context. It often has to come from multiple disciplines. Systematic reviews are one methodology, but they're by no means complete. And in many areas of international development, they're not really adequate at all because there aren't enough studies that meet systematic review criteria. As simple as that. So you've got to start using some of the grey literature because there is nothing else in that situation. But the principle is you've got to at least take some attempt at saying which studies are strong or which ones aren't, which are relevant, which ones are not. And you also have to have a methodology. And again, one of the things that's very striking if you look at policy documents based on evidence is they don't tell you how they collected that evidence almost ever. And actually starting off with a proper description of how you reached the decision you did is important, whether it's a systematic review or not. Health, of course, has, in international development terms, probably the best database we currently have got. And there's still enormous gaps in that. There are many areas of what we're doing which we are flying blind at this moment in time, and there are many questions that people in the London School will be needing to answer for at least the rest of my professional lifetime, I'm glad to say, as they employ me. But there are, if you look across international development as a whole, health is by far the best evidenced area of international development. I'll state that as a fact. I'm happy for people to challenge that. There are many areas like education, anti-corruption, conflict, which are really important. Everybody in this room would agree that these are as important as health, for sure. And yet in many of these, we do not know which of the various things we do, and we do lots of things, which of those things really work and which of these things don't. We haven't a flying clue, frankly, in a large amount of what we're doing. I think the question that follows from that is, are these intrinsically more difficult? Is examining something in education actually more difficult than health? Clearly it's different. Clearly the methodologies have to be different. Clearly the timelines are different from some of these other things. But the question is, are they absolutely more difficult? And I think the evidence for that really is pretty weak, frankly. That's fine. I'm on time. General principles. So there are some general principles which I think are relevant in medicine from healthcare, which I think work across all areas of international development. And I would say these are so uncontentious in medicine, people might think, why am I putting them up there? But they are actually contentious in other areas. The first and the most important is that experts are often dangerously wrong, and the fact they're highly trained, experienced, reflexive, motivated, self-confident, well-paid, and agree is completely irrelevant. They're still wrong. And if you don't test, you don't know. The third thing is that ethical issues are serious, but they're soluble. They have been solved in health, and health is a serious issue because people die, one way or the other. More people die in one group than the other. Quantitative studies, including trials, are very, very powerful, but they're usually insufficient, sometimes irrelevant, and they are not able to test true impact in a number of situations. Profound change usually comes from multiple incremental tested improvements rather than people who think they can do a grand theory of absolutely everything based on one small study, which I'm afraid is still prevalent in quite large areas of international development. And systematic synthesis is essential. Some of the methods in medicine may be relevant to other areas. Individual trials, cluster trials, quantitative observational studies. I'm going to make a real plea for case control studies, a cheaper, more effective methodology. I cannot understand why other people have not stolen case control methodology in the way they've stolen trials. Actually, this is much more useful for getting quick results in a large number of areas, and yet it's not used. Systematic reviews, obviously, modelling methods, but they all need adaptation. None of these will be able to be translated straight across. My final point, my final slide, is what has medicine got to learn from the other areas? And I'm afraid here that there is a degree of complacency in the medical academic hierarchy, which is not new. If you look back at textbooks anywhere in the last 1,500 years, they'll all talk about how stick in the mud and self-confident, incorrectly, doctors are. Sir Lancelot Spratt here, I think, was a pretty good example of that. Many medics, I think, believe they've now got a toolkit which can solve all problems in healthcare. I absolutely disagree with that. I think in many areas of public health, we do not have the tools properly to answer some of the key questions that we need to. And I think as impact evaluation and many other methodologies are developing in other disciplines, education for example, we should be looking to steal their ideas as, quite rightly, they sometimes have stolen ours. And I think the methodologies, as these snowball, the methodologies which are new and which should be appropriate for healthcare will be increasing the whole time. And qualitative social science and economics, not so much the London School, but almost every other institution I know in the UK, are still dramatically underused. The number of medical schools in the UK that do very good clinical trials and don't ever put a social or an economic aspect to it is extraordinary to me. In fact, it's all of them, apart from this place, with 2 or 3 exceptions. And that is quite worrying, because if you're a policymaker, it's actually those things are as important as the end result. Finally, how many of these do we still have in international development? I'm sure there are very, very many, and if we do not test, we will not know which of the things we're doing to vulnerable people with money we all know needs to go to actually affect change, and we have no idea whether it's working or not. We have lots of leeches out there, and we should be testing everything. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much for, as usual, very spirited and very focused account of the area. We will be returning to the themes that Chris has raised after we've heard from Howard. So without any further ado, let's ask Howard to, I think, talk about some of the experiences we've had from over 100 impact evaluations in international development, and I hope it'll segue from what we've heard from Chris. So please welcome Howard White.
Thank you, Phil. So just to build on Chris's last point, in the private sector, in both the developed and developing world, a stylized fact is that 80% of firms fail in the first 5 years. 80% of firms go out of business. Do we think that the public sector and development field performs better than that? It's not really terribly likely, but they don't have the market test of the bottom line to put them out of business when they fail. So it's just very likely indeed there are many, many leeches out there which are failing but not being tested. It's only through use of rigorous impact evaluations, which can be randomized controlled trials, but they can use other methods, that we can tell if development programs are achieving the intended benefits of saving lives, getting girls into school, empowering poor women, and so on. So it's really quite essential that the development field learn from evidence-based medicine and the thousands of lives that have been saved over the years for the adoption and use of evidence in the medical field. But at the same time, recognizing also many of these limitations that Chris mentioned, that they do apply equally. Now, 10 years ago, when the idea of using randomized control trials in development interventions started to be mooted, there was a widespread reaction, which can still be heard today. There's a big conference coming up at IDS along these lines, of it's not possible. Oh, social interventions, development interventions, they're too complex. You can't, just for things we were hearing from Chris just now, you can't generalize. Well, the fact is, what we've learned in the last 10 years is that randomized controlled trials can and have been used for a very broad range of development interventions, but they are delivering evidence on what works and what doesn't, and that evidence is being used by policymakers across the world. Maybe in some cases being overused for some of the reasons that Chris made. But the first lesson would be that rigorous impact evaluations, including randomized controlled trials, can and have delivered the type of evidence that can and has been used by policymakers. And I'm going to give a few examples, mostly of examples from studies that have been funded by 3IE in the last few years. But I'll start with a non-3IE study, one of the best-known examples of the Oportunidades program in Mexico. I imagine most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with this program. This was a conditional cash transfer, so it gives money to poor families conditional upon them undertaking certain behaviour, which is primarily sending their children to school. It also relates to mothers going to antenatal care when they're pregnant. And this program was designed as a randomized controlled trial in 600 rural communities. It was what we call randomized across the pipeline, or stepwise design, where the first 200 or so communities got this intervention in the first year, another 200 or so got it in the second year, and the last 200 in the third year, and the order in which the program was rolled out, which year you got it in for the first time, was decided at random. So you're in year 1 or year 3 at random. So those that were going to get the program in year 3 served as the control group for those communities that got the program in year 1. This impact evaluation found Progressa, which was started in 1996, to be a big success, having a large impact on getting children into school, increased take-up of health services by women. And the result was that, this was the Progressa program when it started. The government changed. And the Progressa program staff went to the government and said, look, here's the evidence on Progressa, here's the evidence on what Progressa's achieved. So we think that Progressa should continue. And the government looked at the evidence, and the president said, well, we've looked at the evidence, but we're going to close Progressa down. We're going to start a new program called Oportunidades. Oportunidades is going to have the same structure and design as Progressa. It's going to have the same level of benefits and conditions. Actually, it's going to have the same beneficiaries as Progressa. So Oportunidades was Progressa. All they did was rename the program. So unusually, an anti-poverty program survived a political transition and has continued to this day based on the strength of the evidence from a randomized controlled trial. So what do you use evidence for? If you find a program's working, you keep doing that program, you take it to scale. Here's a second, more recent example from a 3I-funded study of preschools in rural Mozambique. Randomized controlled trial across 70 rural communities, providing very low-cost preschool in these areas. Local woman from the village, trained to be a preschool teacher, some basic learning materials provided by the program, made locally, so toys made locally in the community. What this study found was that children in the program communities, children where the preschool was operating, were 25% more likely to go on to primary education than were children in the comparison communities. These children had stronger cognitive development, stronger development of social skills than did children in the comparison communities. The siblings, the older siblings of the children in these communities were 7% more likely to go to preschool, because they're free to go to elementary school, because they're freed up from childcare responsibilities. So this program showed very clearly what we know from preschools in Latin America about cognitive development gains. We see also in rural Africa, you see the same gains to child development, and you see the same gains to primary school enrollment. And what's happened as a result is this program's now been taken to scale, going to 600 communities across the country. It started as a pilot in 70 communities, well, 35 communities, and now it's been taken to scale in 600 communities. A program works, take it to scale. That's what evidence is for. You pilot something, if it's working, you take it to scale. If it's not, you don't. And we'll see examples of that later on. Finally, this is a program to tackle iron deficiency, anemia, in rural China. Anemia rates are as high as 50% or more in some areas of poor areas in rural China. Anemia is linked to deficient cognitive development and therefore learning difficulties. The program, again, a randomized controlled trial across 60 schools, so operated in 30 schools and not in another 30, gave a vitamin pill containing iron to the children in the treatment schools. Iron levels went up, anemia went down, learning outcomes improved by 0.2 of a standard deviation more in the comparison in the treatment schools from the comparison schools in just a 2-month period. That's a huge gain. Typically at this age, children learn 0.2 of a standard deviation in a year. And these children were like skipping a year. They were learning 0.2 standard deviation more in just 2 months as a result of this very cheap intervention that costs just 5 or 6 pence a day. It's a hugely successful intervention that was taken to scale in this and in neighbouring provinces. In some neighbouring provinces, they actually said, well, how about trying this programme or these foodstuffs rather than the vitamin pills, and they agreed to do experiments to try out different types of programme to tackle nutritional deficiencies and improve learning outcomes in these poor areas. So a programme works, take it to scale, experiment some more, see what works better, see what's most cost effective. There are policymakers out there in Mexico, in Mozambique, in China, who are ready to listen to these lessons and learn from them and implement programs that lead to healthier children, stronger learning outcomes as a result. Other times what you want to do is change program design based on evidence. And as I'll go on and say in a little while, it's not always just the evidence of impact you're interested in. Often you're interested in evidence just of other aspects of the causal chain. So here was a planned conditional cash transfer in Ghana, and the evaluation team said, well, wait a moment. You're planning to give out a conditional cash transfer, which is just 5%, just over 5% of the value of consumption of the target households. If you look at international experience, typically conditional cash transfers are around 15 to 25% of the value of the consumption of the target households. 5% is really very small. The only other case not shown here where it was around 5% was in Honduras, where there wasn't much evidence of impact. So we think 5% is too small. And as a result of that simple factor analysis, the government did raise the value of the transfer before starting the program. In another case, another conditional cash transfer in Indonesia, the evaluation looked at different targeting mechanisms and found that using community-based targeting both improved the effectiveness of targeting for the poorest households, but also increased the community acceptance of the program, which the government saw as being important. So the response of the government to the evaluation findings was to change the targeting mechanism. They still use proxy means targeting as their main targeting mechanism, which means they go and identify poor households by objective observable criteria like housing quality and education. But then they give the list of target households to the community, a community meeting, community leaders and so on, to go through the list, and the community can add households or take them off that list. And so they're combining the two targeting mechanisms. And finally, a case from West Bengal where an impact study we financed showed that water pricing introduced in the mid-2000s had led to effectively a drying up of a secondary market. That means people have tube wells selling water to smaller farmers without tube wells. That has stopped happening since water pricing had been introduced. And so smaller farmers had stopped irrigating, and yields and output was falling in West Bengal. As a result of the study findings making this link, the government reduced the price of electricity connections to operate tube wells for small farmers and reduced licensing restrictions for small farmers to operate tube wells to increase the take-up of tube well water and irrigation water in West Bengal. So evidence leads to changes in policy. So first, we saw evidence where programs are working and taken to scale. Second, we see evidence where programs can be changed, or design can be changed to make them work more effectively. And finally, we can see evidence where programs weren't working and so get stopped. Here's an example of a cook stoves project in Ghana. I'll say more about it later on. But the main point here is that the expected benefits in terms of reduced smoke inhalation, reduced use of fuel wood, better health, were not being realized. So they did a randomized controlled trial of these improved cook stoves, found they weren't realizing the expected benefits, and so the NGO halted the program, did not roll it out as planned. So programs don't go as expected, don't yield expected benefits, don't go ahead and pilot, don't go ahead and roll it out. So if things don't work, stop doing them. We had a final example of informing policy, wage subsidy in South Africa. So this is a policy that's recently been introduced. And there's a lot of opposition to this policy from particularly the trade unions. And the point made by the trade unions was that, well, if you give a wage subsidy to employ youth, firms will employ youth and lay off existing workers. And what this study, an earlier study had found that we financed, was that there was an increase amongst youth who received the subsidy of around 25% increase in employment, but there was no reduction in the employing firms and other employees. So there was no employment displacement effect from this scheme. And in the Treasury document that announced this program recently, they cited this study. So the study is making its way into government documentation to back up adopting the program because the adverse effects that critics were expecting weren't observed. So we've seen examples now from across the world, from Latin America and Asia, from Africa, where policymakers are using the results from rigorous impact evaluations. These aren't just academic studies to be published in journals and left on the shelves. They are finding their way to policymakers and influencing policy. But it doesn't stop there, because at 3IE, as Phil mentioned in the introduction, we're very keen on studies that have a good theory of change. And I want to say a bit to explain why the theory of change is important. So causal chain analysis provides a basis for understanding impact and enhances policy relevance. Let's see why that is. Now, we ask people to give theories of change, and they go one of two ways with this. Either you get a diagram that has little arrows everywhere. Yes, just remember the song from the 1960s from Leapy Lee, Little Arrows Everywhere? That's what they do. And there's not much analysis based on the little arrows everywhere, but they have nice diagrams with little arrows everywhere. Or they have this, which basically says inputs, process outputs, outcomes. It's not actually that informative. And actually, an important point to realize is that, in fact, what the diagram looks like, or should look like, is this. And I want to explain what I mean by that by what I call the funnel of attrition. And the point about the funnel of attrition is you don't reach most of the people you think you're going to reach. And most of our expectations about the impact of programs is based on the assumption everyone we want to reach in a program actually gets reached. And it ain't so. So let's take an example here where we target 100 people. So we're going out with a program and we think 100 people are going to benefit this program. Well, not all of those 100 are going to know about this program. Unless we've got really good dissemination and outreach, probably 60 to 75%, here I've been optimistic, 75% of the people actually know about the program. So those 25% that don't know about it, they're not going to benefit, they're not going to take part, forget about them, you've lost them already. And then of the 75 that actually know about it, maybe only 45 take part. The fact is, not everyone wants to do the development programs that you're putting out there for their benefit. Maybe you're doing something they're not interested in. Maybe you're doing something that offends their social norms. Maybe you're doing something, offering some counselling or training or something they would be interested in, but you do it during the daytime and they've got a job. Or maybe you offer it at some facility or health centre or something that's 10 kilometres away, across a river, the other side of a mountain. They just can't get to it. Or take them 2 to 3 hours to get to it. It's just not worth it. The costs of participation are too high. So the fact is, not so many people take part, then of those that take part, who actually engages sufficiently with the program to benefit from in some way, and I'm not going through all the steps, I'll give a couple of examples in a moment, but you get right down here, and maybe there are actually 15 people that of the first 100 you start with that change their behaviour in a way that means they might benefit from the program. So your denominator of those you're actually going to change is not the 100 you first thought of, it's only down to these 15. So the program actually is benefiting far fewer people than you thought it would. It's not going to benefit the whole target community because they don't know about it, they don't care about it, they don't turn up, they get there, they're not interested, they don't understand what you're saying, whatever reason, they don't benefit. Let's just see some examples of that. Here's a social fund in Malawi, from a social fund study we did about 10 years ago at the World Bank. And in Malawi, let's look at Malawi in particular. In Malawi, nearly 100%, 95% of people in a representative sample out in villages had heard of the social fund. Okay? But if you look at how many knew about the meeting at which the community project chosen by the community, according to social fund theory, the communities picks a project, well, only 60% knew there was a meeting, and around 45% attended the meeting, and only around 10–15% spoke at the meeting. So this is part of the theory of change for social funds, is that by participating in community decision-making, people's capacity for community decision-making gets built as they'll go on and do further community-based planning and development of their own development projects. Well, it's not happening, and we've found no impact on social capital because only a very small percentage are actually actively participating in decision-making. They know about the project, but by the time it gets to actually participating in decision-making, it's a tiny percentage. Let's take another example. Let's take training. Let's take a lecture like this one. Lots of development interventions are based on training. And we think that if you train people, they'll go and do stuff that we want them to do as a result of that training. Well, not everybody's an A student. Yes? Not everybody understands everything they hear in class. So here we take a typical workshop. The first thing people have to do is show up. Okay? We've got lots of empty chairs here. All these people that said they're going to come haven't come. They're not going to learn anything. They're home watching Big Bang Theory. They're not going to learn anything from that. Okay? So forget about them. So they have to show up. So we've got show up means actually show up in the country because this is a workshop. And then they have to attend the workshop and stay and not leave and sneak out the back halfway through. And then they've got to stay awake, which is a bit of a challenge. There's someone in the front here you'll see who's not managed that. And if I go on much longer, there'll be a couple at the back over there, I think, who might not quite manage it as well. So not everyone manages to stay awake. And if they do manage to stay awake, they've got to pay attention. Okay, which is a bit of a challenge. You've got your mobile phone, you know, you've got your different games you can play on your app, on your iPad and so on. So paying attention for 25 minutes is a bit of a challenge. And then you'll understand what I'm saying, which is a challenge, I know. So there you go. And then you've got to agree with what I'm saying, because it's important. We're moving now into cognitive psychology. And people have to internalize what you're telling them. An important part of the internalization process is agreeing. That helps you absorb the information. You've got to remember it tomorrow. You know, that's really a challenge for most people. What did you do yesterday? Oh, I went to a lecture. Was it good? Oh, yes. What was it about? Yes. So, you know, then having remembered what it was and agreed with it, all that stuff, then you've got to act on it as well. You have to go out and do something. So we've got the 100 people that plan to show up. We're down to, 3 or 4 that might actually do something different as a result of attending a workshop. It's not very many. It's not surprising impact is not very large. So when we have loads of programs finding an insignificant impact, well, was it a design failure or whatever? What was the problem? Implementation failure? You need to look at the funnel of attrition. You need to understand, didn't people know about the program? So you didn't disseminate it effectively. Did they know about it but not turn up? Why was that? Weren't they interested? Was it put at a bad time or place? Were community leaders opposed to the programme? If you don't involve community leaders in promoting the programme, you can alienate them. They can actually speak out against the programme. I think of polio in Nigeria and Pakistan right now as an extreme example. But community leaders are extremely important. Training is normally very effective. If you just give a lecture to people, it's meant to go away and be able to do something differently just by talking to them about an interactive training. It's not going to work. So have you got effective training? If you tell them to do something, have they got the necessary complementary inputs to go and do that thing you're telling them to do? So the funnel of attrition helps you understand the causal chain and the assumptions underlying the causal chain for those different steps to operate. Many interventions fail at the first hurdle. So, oops, I didn't want the text as well. So this thing is a male medical circumcision device. You can figure out how it works. Now, if you go and do a survey in areas in Africa of high HIV/AIDS incidence, around 65 to 70% of men who aren't circumcised say, yes, I want to be circumcised because I understand it reduces risk of getting HIV/AIDS. But when you turn up on the doorstep with the scissors, 70% of men don't get circumcised. So, in fact, in the trial that we did, only 25% got circumcised if it was free. If I had to pay anything, it fell to 10%. So the impact of the programme is undermined considerably by the fact people just don't take part. And clearly, the main hypothesis of this project, that it was the cost that was the main barrier, so if we took away the cost barrier, it would go up to 60, 75%, clearly wasn't true. There are other barriers to why men don't slip it into this little white device. We had a preschool program in Mexico where parents had registered to take part in the preschool program. They actually registered they were going to send their children to preschool. Once the evaluation started, fewer than 10% of the parents sent their children to the preschool. So you're doing an impact evaluation of the impact of this preschool on these children. 90% of them aren't going to the school at all. No impact. You don't need an impact evaluation to tell you there's no impact on those children. And no impact on most of the children, because that's most of the children. A study, insurance schemes, typically take-up is less than 10%. Insurance schemes, 3%, 4%, 5% take-up is not unusual. Oh yeah, okay. This is a study where we're going to finance and we pulled the plug on. This was an idea to send SMS messages to parliamentarians in an African country to tell them about issues of the day. And the idea was to send out several thousand text messages, but when they looked at what was going on, they found there was a technical error, and only 2,000 had been sent. And of those 2,000 that had been sent, only 100 had been opened, and that was all by the same person. So we thought it probably wasn't worth doing an impact evaluation. So we said, yeah, we're not so keen on that one. There was actually similar to this one, was not one of ours, it was another study, by in the Philippines, where there's a national health insurance scheme, PhilHealth, in the Philippines. And you have to pay 600 peso, it's like $15 a month, to subscribe to PhilHealth. And they sent by SMS a voucher to give you a 50% subsidy, so you only had to pay 300 pesos a month to take part in PhilHealth. They sent out 1,000 SMSs as a randomized controlled trial to encourage people to take up PhilHealth. And of the 1,000 SMSs, only 67 took part. So again, there's just very, very low take-up, less than 1% take-up. They did have some nice people reply to the messages. One person replied, I wish you had sent this message yesterday because the boat's just gone. Now I can't go for another month to the health clinic. So what we learn is the money wasn't the constraint. But again, you didn't need an impact evaluation to find that out. So what we're stressing now at 3IE, and it's something that Chris mentioned, is we're stressing the need to have good formative research before you do an impact evaluation. There's no point in us going out and doing an impact evaluation of impact of a program that 10% of people want. We know it's not going to have a large impact because so few people want it. You might want to do an impact evaluation of trying to increase usage, but you know that's not the way. So there has to be formative research there, or we're going to fund formative research as a first phase of an impact evaluation, and we won't go ahead with the impact evaluation if take-up is too low, like the texting parliamentarians.
2 minutes.
Yeah, right, it's going to happen. Okay, I'll skip this one. Oh, just to mention on the Ghana cook stoves, participation, they did the cook stoves, participation falls over time. It fallen to 50% of households have stopped using the cook stoves after just 8 months. And we'll come on to why in a moment. Okay, so I'll skip on that one. Lesson 3. Randomized controlled trials, they've had policy influence. But as we've just seen, addressing the causal chain, look at evidence along the causal chain, looking at the funnel of attrition, brings you much more powerful evidence. And so by having, it's not being a randomized controlled trial alone that makes you a gold standard evaluation. There's no way at all in which 3IE believes, oh, RCTs are the gold standard. No one ever says to you, oh, 3IE thinks RCTs is the gold standard. It is the most untrue thing you could say. Okay? Of all the untrue things you can think of, that's the most untrue. Okay? What we believe is that it is about having a good understanding of context and answering a policy question of interest. So let's give a couple of examples. The female hairdressers. So this was a scheme to increase take-up of female condoms by marketing female condoms through hairdressers in Lusaka. Now, what the researchers were interested in was if you give a cash incentive, does this have a bigger impact or smaller impact depending on the amount of the incentive, or alternatively, giving social recognition? So you give some award in a social ceremony to the hairdresser. And they found that the social recognition had the largest impact on the sales of female condoms through hairdressers. So their conclusion is that social marketing campaigns ought to turn to using social recognition for marketing products like female condoms. What they didn't really bring out in their study, you have to read in one of the footnotes to understand, is that the average sales of female condoms in this program was 1 packet a month. Okay? So 1 packet a month is hardly going to reverse the tide of HIV/AIDS in Zambia. So what was really policy relevant in this study was not highlighted by the impact evaluators. Cook stoves in Ghana, so this had a bit of a design failure. We have a problem at 3IE a bit, what we call researcher-driven interventions, where the researchers have a bright idea and they want to try it out, and they pay insufficient attention to experience from people in the sector. So these researchers built this cook stove. And as I said, when they went back 8 months later, 50% had stopped using it. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. As you can see, the improved cook stove has a single ring on it. You can put a single pot on it. Now, a lot of these households were engaging in what researchers called unexpected cooking behavior. Unexpected cooking behavior included such bizarre things as using more than 1 pot to cook a meal. Can you imagine doing that? More than 1 pot to cook a meal? Oh, that's very unexpected. And the thing is that traditionally, people cook outside. And these cook stoves are mostly built inside. So you've got your improved cook stove inside over here, and you've got your old stove out here, and you're having to cook with 2 pots, so you're having to run back like this, okay, while you're cooking your meal. And then you think, well, blow this for a game of soldiers. I'm not going to use that anymore. I'm going to use my traditional stove with 3 rings here. We pointed out to the researchers there's a lot of polygamy in northern Ghana. And so you actually have a household compound with many wives. And so the cooking has to be taking place outside for social reasons. You can't cook inside any one house. So if you put the cook stove in someone's house, they can't really use it for social reasons. So we said to the researchers, you have to understand the social context in which means people have to cook outside. So putting the improved stove inside stops them using it. In their revised report, they wrote, people might prefer to cook outside because it's a sunny day. So researchers are not always that good at understanding context. Nearly finished, Phil. Okay, so last example. So this is an example in Latin America of a scheme in 3 countries to deliver an improved house in slum areas. So it's done by this NGO of young professionals who on a voluntary basis come in and they get this packaged house, costs $1,000, and they demolish a slum building, which is really, I mean, it's slums. It's people living in cardboard boxes and polythene, that sort of stuff. So they demolish the existing house and they put in place this 1-bedroom house in place. It takes a couple of days. And this study is a good example, I call the cult of significance. Because what the researchers say is, well, we find a significant impact on the quality of housing and on people's satisfaction with their housing. But if you look at the results, what you see is that compliance is up around 80, 85, 87%. So around nearly 90% of households got the new house. They offered the new house and they took it. What percentage of households have improved floors, walls and ceilings and so on? Is actually around 30%. So the striking thing in this study is, well, 85% have got this new improved house compared to the cardboard box lived in before, but the data show that only less than half of those actually report both objectively, that's objective data, and subjectively, the quality of housing has gone up. It's a real puzzle that the researchers don't seem able to explain because they didn't collect data that allowed them to do so, but they hadn't noticed this themselves. They just said, oh, a significant impact on the quality of housing. They're not looking at the right question. That's not always true. Let's go back to South Africa. The really interesting thing in South Africa is that whilst employment went up by 25%, of those employers that employed a youth with a voucher, so the way it worked was the youth got the voucher, and if I employ you for a voucher, I can cash in the voucher. Only 8% of employers employing a youth for the voucher actually cashed in the voucher. So how is the voucher working? Either it's a signalling mechanism that these youth are somehow more employable, actually it's not true, it's a random allocation, or it increases the confidence of the youth to go out and get a job and keep a job, because the effect's still there after 2 years. And to the credit of the researchers, they investigate these different hypotheses the best they can with the data that's available to them. So just randomizing is not enough. You have to think a lot more about the context, the way the program will work, and what are the evaluation questions of interest to policymakers to change policies, change programs, get better programs, better policies, and so improve lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Right. We do have 20 minutes. Longer if you want to stay longer, but I guess you don't. We thought we'd bring this little table out and ask Chris and Howard to maybe join us here. And can people start showing hands if they've got questions they would like to ask? Ladies back, that's one. Takes two at a time. Two ladies at the back. Great. Keep on thinking. 3, 4, my gosh, we'll be able to 7:30. That's good. Right.
I can speak very loud.
Well, we've got people running around with mics that probably don't work, but we can try it. So 2 questions first, and then there's one here. There was one. There's a hand around somewhere. So I've got this lady here.
Thank you very much for the 2 very interesting talks. I have, I think I need a clarification on evidence and the use of evidence. I understand that we need evidence to inform policies because policies tend to be value-based and we need to make sure that they are grounded on evidence, But are evidence not value-based as well? How do we decide what we measure and how we measure it? And my question is especially related to Howard's mention of conditional cash transfers, which appear to be the magic bullet in development. But what do we measure when we measure the impacts of conditional cash transfers? And I'm thinking about the way it tends to reinforce gender stereotypes. So where is the evidence there, and how is it being used? Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
One question, second one, please.
Hello. You asked why are there more gaps of evidence in other areas than health? And I have a little story to tell, maybe shed some light on it. I've got funding from the German government to do an impact evaluation on something working with agriculture and gardening on health, which 3IE has also funded that systematic review, saying there's no evidence. And it's proved really, really hard to find an NGO working in that area who has a timeline that fits with a research evaluation. So usually they only find out that they get funding a few months before they actually have to start already giving the intervention. And then it's also a very short timeline until they have to show impact. And the same is even true. I've now talked to Helen Keller International in Bangladesh, who are very keen to work with me. And they are they received extra funding from SHIRI via DFID, but that has to start in June and already finish in 2 years. And I think that may be one of the reasons.
Thank you. So 2 issues there. One, the first question was really, well, it became conditional cash transfers, but a broader issue is how do we know what to measure? And the second was about the timing of evaluation. Chris, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you want to respond first?
I'll take the second question because the first one I think was directed specifically to Howard. This issue of timing is a real problem, but I don't think it's specific to any particular discipline, with one exception, and the exception is humanitarian work. Humanitarian work, it's a real problem for many reasons, but humanitarian work tends to be funded on extremely short time cycles, even when it is obvious that the problem, like Darfur, is going to be that has been there for 10 years and will be there for 10 years. It's still funded on 6-month repeated cycles, and this makes any kind of evaluation very difficult. Additionally, obviously, there are things like emergencies which happen suddenly out of the blue, and they're even more problematic. But I don't think the problem you raise doesn't seem to me specific to any particular sector outside that area. It is a problem in many areas of health, agriculture, education, but there are many other areas which are longer term. One of the ways of getting around that, in fact, is to have the intervention funded out of the research funds. And there are a number of NGOs, for example, HealthNet International did some extremely interesting work on this in health, where it actually did the actual interventions which help the population on the back of funding for their research. And they have people there doing that long term. So there are ways around it. It doesn't mean it's not a problem, but I think it's a soluble problem. And it doesn't seem to me the reason why there's this huge disparity between different disciplines.
Howard, second question? First question.
So there are many types of evidence, many different types of data. And the data you require to answer any particular question depends on what the question is. And so sometimes it will be, I like to distinguish between factual and counterfactual rather than between quantitative and qualitative. And factual and counterfactual data both of those can be quantitative or qualitative. So often there'll be examples, for example, analysis of targeting, where you use quantitative data on whether targeting has succeeded or not, whether they're type 1 or type 2 errors of inclusion or exclusion. But we might use qualitative analysis to understand why targeting mechanisms are working or failing. And so the question is, how do you decide whether a particular bit of evidence is credible or not? And in the impact evaluation field, we've pretty much got an understanding around that, around identification strategies, around avoiding fearful selection bias, but also around issues like possibility of contagion and so on we have to be wary of. And so there is some sort of consensus around what credible evidence looks like in that particular area. And I think if you pick a particular area like, say, targeting, which is a favourite one of mine, we can probably also agree what constitutes credible evidence. The problem for primary studies, particularly small N impact evaluations, but also for systematic reviews that try to run other types of evidence beyond effectiveness evidence, is that there's much less consensus around what constitutes credible evidence. I know Sandy Oliver's here somewhere, she might want to comment on this. But our feeling through IE is that there's less consensus over what constitutes credible evidence, so doing review in those areas is more difficult, and doing impact evaluations becomes accepted as more difficult because there isn't the same consensus around what constitutes evidence. But my view would be you can talk about what constitutes good evidence, and a lot of it is based on what Chris said, which is documenting how you collected your data. That's the start.
I understood your question differently, which may be wrong. I may well be wrong, but I understood it to ask the question, is there not a value system intrinsic in the actual collection of the evidence? And the answer is yes, of course there is. You can do what you can to minimise the likelihood that's going to affect the result you get. But we all start off with biases, we all start off with intellectual structures, many of which we're not even conscious of directly, and all we can do is try and reduce the impact that has on the outcome. We'll never eliminate it completely.
The question there. There was a second question here. Did I miss it? Okay, the question, gentleman at the back, and then I have 2 questions over here. I mean, it's the very top, the lady in the white shirt on. Keep it fit.
Hello, good evening again. Thank you very much. I'm actually from the Disasters Emergency Committee, so your comments on humanitarian are very relevant. As you said, getting the question right is terribly important, is vitally important. But I was also thinking about unintended impacts and whether your methodology with 3IE enables the researchers to look more broadly at whatever intervention you're looking at and consider the unintended impacts. I had a subsequent question, but I think there are so many, I'll leave others maybe come back to it.
Very good question. We have an answer for that. Gentleman up there, next to you.
Thank you very much. I had two questions, but I'll probably stick to one. So to Chris Whitty, I wanted to find out this idea of if you don't test, you don't know. And in international development, I work for site servers, so we receive public funds. We receive funds from the taxpayer. Do we have the room to actually go out and test because the taxpayer wants us to deliver for the beneficiaries? To what extent can we actually go out and test whether something works, or do we need to rely on grey evidence or grey literature or stuff that has already been tested? Where do we stand?
So I think the first question is really for Howard. The second question from the site servers would be for Chris.
Yes, thank you. So, indeed you can. It really requires you, of course, include the possible unintended consequences in your analytical and data collection framework. And there are a couple of ways in which you can seek to ensure that happens. The one we have stressed historically is you lay out a theory of change, and the theory of change may include what I call a counter theory, which lays out where there might be possible adverse consequences from intervention that people have spoken about. So, to take a particular example in your areas, we were involved in discussions around design and evaluation for cash transfers in refugee camps, where clearly there's possibilities of just creating inflation and so things become more expensive, and no one benefits in terms of increased purchasing power as a result, would be one adverse consequence of that. And possibly increased use of not goods as economists rather than essentials might be another one. The second way in which you might get at possible adverse consequences is through qualitative formative research. And we do stress the need for doing qualitative formative research as part of doing good impactful design. So you can pick up what both would be the local perceptions and priorities of possible adverse consequences of interventions before doing the impact evaluation. I understand in a humanitarian setting, as Chris mentioned, you haven't got the luxury of time often. So you might want to do that research elsewhere, or actually be doing that research elsewhere already, or it may well be being done. So you generate your hypothesis for existing research elsewhere before setting up your impact evaluation for the new intervention. Just to follow up a little bit on that, we have got a working paper on impact evaluation of humanitarian interventions, which talk about recreating baselines, since you can't go out and collect the baseline after the disaster, which are worth looking at. But for other types of intervention during disaster settings, it's not impossible you could consider localised individual randomisation, because the fact that we don't know if things work or not is just true that it is elsewhere. And so I recognise there are more ethical and logistical constraints, but I wouldn't rule it out completely.
Do you want to try the second question?
Yeah. My view would be that if you are a philanthropic organisation doing a seriously important piece of work with public money, you've got at least two reasons you should be testing. For the philanthropic side, because you want to be doing the best possible for your client base, your recipients, and the public money because you don't want to be wasting it on things that are completely pointless. And Sightsavers is a very good example of an NGO which has supported logistically and intellectually fantastic research. Much of what is done on the background of Sightsavers and some of its the NGOs who work with it, who over the years have added enormously to the evidence base on things like trachoma. So I think Sightsavers is an excellent example of how it can be done well.
Thank you. I have two questions here. This lady and this lady here. I'm taking them two at a time because I think that is a nice package. Liz?
Also, now that I've been involved in this world, realised that impact evaluations are very fragile things. You know, I've now accumulated a number of anecdotes about impact evaluations that have 3IE as the original intention. And I wondered what 3IE is doing to help us to learn about the impact evaluations that fail, you know, so that when we spend the money and design the impact evaluations that we get, that they actually report, and maybe what we can learn from health impact evaluations, you know, where they've been done for a lot longer.
I think we do that with Howard and Chris, but there is another question here, just here, Annie.
So Chris, you mentioned that we can apply these lessons from the impact of health interventions to other areas, and we've touched a bit on humanitarian work, but I wondered what you thought about applying the lessons to campaigning work, which is arguably even more complicated than normal development initiatives.
Okay. Howard, what do you know about taking trials?
So it is true, of course, particularly randomized controlled trials. In taking those trials may get compromised. In the DIME initiative of the World Bank, where they reached about 200 studies, most of those are planned to be RCTs, and about half of them eventually were, because the randomisation gets compromised in some way or other. And so one lesson of that is to have a plan B. So to go into your design thinking about if the randomisation fails, what would be my instrument for identification in that case. The same problem arises if you have extremely low take-up of the intervention, because when you do a randomised controlled trial, most economic and political science analysis doesn't just do the average treatment effect as a mean comparison treatment control, it does a regression-based analysis, which includes the random assignment as an instrumental variable, and if random assignment is essentially failed because you have such low take-up, then it becomes a problem of identification again. And so thinking about the plan B beforehand is a good idea, rather than having to do it ex post. So when I first started doing applied or micro work, one of the advice I got from Abigail Barr was, always think about your own instruments going into a survey. I think that's true in a randomised controlled trial. Think what plausible instruments you might have, because they're things you wouldn't otherwise collect in your evaluation plan. So think what they might be. The ones that we've had fail, as it were, are usually the ones with low take-up of the intervention. And that's what's led us to say now there must be formative research. Either you can demonstrate there'll be sufficient take-up to do impact evaluation, or there'll be a phase one of formative research before we fund the full-scale impact evaluation. And that's not the only problem you encounter. The other problems you encounter would be to do with opposition to randomisation. And so that's something else we've learned from, we do now field supervision of our grants. So we learned from this field supervision is that you have to have buy-in to evaluation design from stakeholders, not just in the central office, but down at the field level, where the things are going to take place. Because if there's opposition to it from field officers, then they can easily compromise the design in one way or another. So there has to be some depth of ownership of the idea of doing a randomised controlled trial in the implementing agency. So we have got actually a draft experience paper which reviewed all our grantees submit progress reports on how they're doing. So these stories about implementation teams, value teams being beaten up, rumours are a big problem. And we had a blog on our website on rumours a couple of months back. So it's looked up features, you'll still find it. So we had one intervention where it was in Bangladesh, it was rumoured that the intervention team was trying to convert people to Christianity. And so the teams were attacked and thrown out of villages. And so we're writing up some of these experiences, but that paper won't be ready for some time, I don't think, but it will be out there eventually.
Chris, can I get you to go talk about the second question on...
Yeah, I'm going to quickly just touch on the first one, which is, this is a very important question. Intervention studies, trials, observational studies fail for multiple reasons. Sometimes they fail for reasons that the people who agreed to fund them in the first place and the people who designed them screwed up. And when you look back on it, you can see they were waiting to happen from the first day. Those ones we should be avoiding. And it's obviously a lot easier in things like health, where actually there's a sort of established mechanism. I think the more experimental the methods, the more new the field, the more fragile the state, the more likely failure is going to be. You just have to accept that some degree of failure is an inevitability of these kind of things. And as long as it wasn't completely predictable, and as long as the question was reasonable, that doesn't really, I don't think that should worry us. We just have to accept it. In terms of the campaigning, I think I'd make 3 points, and it's unrelated to one another in a sense. The first one is campaigning and research of any sort are uneasy bedfellows. The thing you absolutely want to avoid is a situation where the campaigning message drives the result the research is supposed to find. And there's a lot of examples of that, and it's dishonest, and it really should not be done. It's dishonest in every possible way. But an alternative way around those where the campaigners use good research because a killer fact is one of the most powerful campaigning tools. Absolutely. That's entirely legitimate, entirely appropriate, as it should be. There's a wider question, which I think is the one you're asking, which is what research can we do into how much campaigning works? And the answer is there is a very good methodology on this. It is almost exclusively in the private sector. Marketing departments spend a huge amount of the money of most big businesses that pitch directly to customers rather than business to business. And they have many mechanisms for testing whether their messages have landed. And it's in the business schools and the marketing departments that you're going to find the methodology to do this, not, I'm afraid, in even very distinguished institutions like this one on the whole.
Thank you very much. Okay, one more round. Somebody waiting here, and I think you were in early as well.
Great, thank you very much. Could I ask, your work's been controversial. There's been lots of debate about RCTs in general and 3IE specifically over the last 5 years. Do you see those debates getting more constructive or more conflictual at the moment, and why?
And the second question in front. Yes, you. Have you got
So,
a question?
No. So my question is about, relates to the ethics of randomization. I'm not an expert in drug trials, but I understand that when drug trials are being undertaken, the outcomes are monitored closely, and as soon as the result is known one way or the other, if it's harmful or beneficial, the trial is stopped and either everyone gets the treatment or nobody does. And I'm wondering, do you think that is ever possible in development, and should we try and do that?
So I think, Howard, if you could answer the question about are we getting more constructive criticisms and responses on RCTs, and Chris maybe on the second question.
So there are multiple debates going on. There's a hardcore group of opponents to doing randomised controlled trials in the evaluation community, in the academic community, and particularly in the UK. And their position hasn't changed. I don't think they're saying anything new or more persuasive than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think they're saying the same thing. They had, particularly singly, I think, normally failed to engage in debates. And actually the online debate with Chris and Stefan was a bit of an exception, where there was a little bit of discussion. But I have on occasion been on public platforms or on online debates with some of these people, and it's, to my mind, a failure to engage with what we're actually saying. I honestly don't think the same can be leveled at us, because 3IE is very strongly about theory-based impact evaluation, the need to use mixed methods, to use different types of evidence to answer different questions along the causal chain. So my position has always been that people who come from a different evaluation background, not an impact evaluation background, ought to be joining in and working with us, because the impact evaluation combines strong process evaluation components to it. But that's not been the approach of people who come from that hardcore. Within the sort of broader evaluation community of people who will engage with us, then actually I think there's something of a convergence. So we do see, it's not 3IE that's alone in proposing theory of change. It's been around evaluation for a good number of years, and it's become more central in the last 4 or 5 years. I think we claim to be a part of that, but we're certainly not the only part of that. And we have our own contributions to make, but many others are making useful contributions. I think in areas of theory of change analysis, and so on, there are many useful discussions going on, and particularly about debates around the use of evidence, which is the area we're increasingly moving into. We're comparative officers, and there's many areas that have much more experience than most of the organisation, but there are many more, including say the epicentres just down the road from us, who have been doing this longer than we have, that we look to learn from. And I think we've got quite constructive dialogues going on with a lot of partners in the community. It's sadly not true of a certain rump out there who try to undermine the value of what we're doing, but I just think they're basically fundamentally wrong in what they say about the inability to apply these methods to so-called complex interventions. In fact, I have a recent paper come out on mixed methods that does say precisely the black box can be a blessing, not a curse. It cuts through the complexity issue. It just tells you, you do this, this is the consequence. There's a cause and effect, causal relationship there, which should be talked about by virtue of randomization. Doesn't matter, you can't analyze the complexity relationship. We think it's nice to be able to do so, to help you understand better the causal relationships, but actually you don't need it. You can cut through complexity entirely with an RCT, and I think we're seeing many examples of that.
Chris, what can we know about the cessation of trials? Is there a...
I want to just add to that, because I'm actually, although I was forced into a debate, which probably most of you have not read, and there's no reason why you should, which I mentioned, which was a debate, and therefore I was put into a polarised position, I'm slightly less combative than Howard on this point. I think that the majority of people who have some cautions about impact evaluations, and almost every other research methodology, they usually have at least a kernel of a good idea, and often they're right. And we should start from the assumption they're trying to be constructive, and they're actually coming out with good questions we have to address. There are some people who are just going on and on and on, not listening to any of the answers, and they just keep on going. But everyone can see who they are, and they're quite a small number of people, and if you look at the median age of those people compared to the people who are constructively engaging, there is a difference. So I think time will actually deal with this problem. Hopefully they'll retire before they reach that stage. But most people who are critical are being helpfully critical, and I think this is a difficult area which we're all trying to engage in. We're all learning, and I think we should always start from the principle of engaging positively on this. On the point about the ethics, absolutely what you're saying is correct. In most health trials where there is an intervention you can intervene early on in a trial, sometimes you don't need till the very end. There is something called the Data Monitoring Committee which actually can stop something early. It is important. Americans tend to stop things far too early, and then what happens is we find out with a random high or random low, and in the analysis you find out you actually don't have a proper answer. You've got to have a steady nerve and keep going, provided the thing which is doing better is the new treatment. If the thing, it's more difficult if actually the thing that's doing better is the old treatment. Then at that point, you have to close things down a lot faster. So there's what's called an unbalanced design in terms of risk. But that's something, there's no reason why that should not be applied to other areas of international development. And of course, this is done the whole time in health and international development. It's not this is done in international development, it's just not done in certain other areas. And you've just got to have the nerve to keep on going until the answer is definitive, rather than bolting at the first sight of trouble.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know there are many more questions. We do have another activity this evening that people want to go to, so we do need to